Captain Jake Bulldog Morrison was having what he'd generously call a spectacularly bad day. One moment he was hauling a shipment of synthetic coffee beans across the Proxima trade route, humming along to some ancient Earth rock ballad, and the next moment his cargo hauler was getting tractored by a Zephyrian Empire dreadnought, the kind of ship that made his little space truck look like a confused metal beetle next to a chrome-plated whale. "Well, ain't that just peachy?" Jake muttered, watching his dashboard light up like a Christmas tree having an electrical seizure. The universal translator crackled to life with that distinctly pompous tone that all alien authority figures seem to share across the galaxy. "Human vessel, you are now property of the Zephyrian Empire. Prepare for immediate boarding and processing." Jake leaned back in his pilot's seat, which had seen better decades, and scratched his graying beard. "Processing, huh? That sounds about as fun as a root canal performed by a caffeinated octopus." The boarding was swift and professional, if you counted being dragged through corridors by 7-foot-tall purple-skinned aliens with more muscles than a bodybuilding convention as professional. Jake found himself deposited in what could only be described as the galaxy's most uncomfortable interrogation room. In my camp, alien intruders, the walls were a sickly green color that seemed to pulse with its own malevolent energy, and the chair they'd strapped him to felt like it had been designed by someone who'd heard about human anatomy third-hand from a particularly unreliable source. Enter Commander Veltar, stage left, with all the swagger of someone who'd clearly never met a mirror he didn't like. The alien stood nearly 8 feet tall, with skin that shifted between deep purple and electric blue depending on the lighting, and eyes that glowed with what Jake could only assume was either incredible intelligence or really good mood lighting. His uniform was so perfectly pressed it probably had its own zip code, and he carried himself with the kind of arrogance that suggested he'd never been told no by anyone who wasn't immediately vaporized afterward. "So," Veltar began, his voice carrying that universal tone of someone who'd watched too many villain monologues and thought they were instructional videos. "You are the human designated as Captain Jake Morrison." "That's Captain Jake Bulldog Morrison to you, Purple People Eater," Jake replied cheerfully. "And you must be the welcoming committee. I gotta say, your hospitality leaves something to be desired. The chair's about as comfortable as sitting on a cactus, and don't even get me started on the decor." Veltar's eyes narrowed, which was quite an achievement considering they were already doing their best impression of angry searchlights. "You will find, human, that your species' reputation for crude humor will not serve you well here. We have captured 17 of your vessels this cycle alone. Your kind is predictable." "Predictable?" Jake laughed, the sound echoing off the walls like a particularly cheerful death rattle. "Friend, if you think humans are predictable, you clearly haven't been paying attention. We're the species that looked at the concept of survival of the fittest and decided to domesticate wolves just because they looked cute. We're about as predictable as a weather forecast written by a psychic goldfish." The alien commander's skin shifted to a deeper shade of purple, which Jake took as either extreme annoyance or the beginning of an allergic reaction. "Your bravado is noted, Captain Morrison. However, you will find that the Zephyrian Empire has methods for extracting information from uncooperative subjects. We have successfully interrogated over 3,000 species across the galaxy." 3,000, huh? Jake whistled appreciatively. "That's impressive. I'm guessing humans weren't on that list, or we wouldn't be having this cozy little chat right now." Veltar's expression suggested he was beginning to understand why the Empire classified humans as a minor but persistently irritating species. The interrogation was about to begin, and neither of them had any idea just how spectacularly wrong it was about to go. For the next hour, Veltar tried every trick in the standard Imperial Interrogation Manual, 4th edition, revised, for maximum psychological impact. He loomed menacingly, which was admittedly impressive when you're 8 feet tall and glowing like a disco ball having an identity crisis. He made vague threats about the fate of humanity, delivered with the kind of dramatic flair that suggested he'd practiced in front of a mirror. He even tried the classic good cop, bad cop routine, except he was playing both roles, which mostly just made him look like he was having an argument with himself. Jake responded to each technique with the kind of cheerful indifference that could drive a saint to start collecting weapons. To the looming, he said, "You know, you've got really nice skin. Do you use moisturizer, or is that just natural alien genetics?" To the threats, he replied, "Oh, humanity's doomed? That's Tuesday for us. We've been collectively convinced we're about to go extinct since we figured out how to make fire. It's basically our hobby at this point." When Veltar tried the dual personality approach, Jake just looked confused and asked, "Are you having a stroke? Should I call someone? I don't know alien CPR, but I'm willing to give it a shot." By the time Veltar had exhausted his repertoire of standard techniques, His skin had cycled through more colors than a rainbow, having a nervous breakdown. That's when the door hissed open, and in scurried what could only be described as the galaxy's most anxious academic. Dr. Crix looked like someone had taken a praying mantis, given it a PhD in xenopsychology, and then subjected it to a lifetime of administrative paperwork. He stood barely 5 feet tall, which was apparently short, even by Zifrian standards, and his skin had the pale, translucent quality of someone who spent too much time in laboratories and not enough time seeing actual sunlight. His forearms moved in constant, nervous gestures, and he carried a datapad that looked like it had been through several small wars. "Commander Veltar," Dr. Crix said, his voice carrying the kind of tremor that suggested he was perpetually one bad day away from a complete mental breakdown, "I've completed the preliminary psychological profile of the human specimen." "And?" Veltar asked, his tone suggesting that if the news wasn't good, someone was going to be getting a very unpleasant performance review. Dr. Crix's forearms fidgeted with his datapad like he was playing an invisible accordion. "Well, sir, the results are unusual. The human brain patterns don't match any known psychological archetype in our database. In fact, they don't seem to match any rational thought process at all." "Excuse me," Jake interjected cheerfully, "but I'm sitting right here, and I'll have you know my thought processes are perfectly rational. Just this morning I had a completely logical internal debate about whether cereal counts as soup, and I came to a very reasonable conclusion." "What conclusion?" Dr. Crix asked, apparently unable to help himself. "That anyone who thinks cereal is soup is probably the kind of person who puts pineapple on pizza and thinks it's acceptable," Jake replied with the confidence of someone stating a fundamental law of physics. Dr. Crix's skin went from pale to nearly transparent, and he made a note on his datapad with shaking hands. "Commander, I strongly advise against using the neural extraction device on this specimen." Veltar's eyes flared brighter, which Jake was starting to recognize as the alien equivalent of someone rolling their eyes so hard they risked permanent injury. "Dr. Crix, we have used the neural extraction device on over 50 different species. The Corthani warriors, the Sigma Centauri collective minds, even the energy beings from the Vega system. A single human cannot possibly present a challenge." "But sir," Dr. Crix protested, his voice climbing to a pitch that suggested he was about to start hyperventilating. "Humans are different. Their neural patterns are chaotic, contradictory, and frankly, they make no logical sense whatsoever. The preliminary scans show thoughts that seem to jump from topic to topic with no apparent connection. One moment, the subject is thinking about tactical information. The next moment, he's remembering something called, 'That time I accidentally superglued my fingers together trying to fix my coffee maker.' That was a Tuesday," Jake added helpfully, "and technically the coffee maker worked perfectly after that. I just couldn't use my hands for a week." Veltar had heard enough. He gestured to 2 guards who wheeled in a device that looked like a cross between a medieval torture instrument and a really aggressive hairdryer. The neural extraction device hummed with malevolent energy, and various lights blinked in patterns that suggested it was either calibrating or preparing to achieve sentience and take over the ship. "Dr. Crix, prepare the device," Veltar commanded, his skin shifting to a determined shade of deep blue. "I have interrogated the minds of creatures that can bend reality with their thoughts. I have extracted secrets from hive minds containing billions of individuals. One human truck driver will not defeat me." As they strapped the neural interface to Jake's head, he looked up at Veltar with the kind of grin that should have been a warning sign visible from orbit. "Hope you brought a helmet, pal. Things are about to get weird." The moment Commander Veltar activated the neural extraction device and his consciousness touched Jake's mind, he knew he had made a terrible mistake. It was like stepping through what he thought was a doorway into an orderly library and instead finding himself in the middle of a tornado made entirely of caffeinated squirrels and existential dread. The first thing that hit him was the noise. Not sound exactly, but mental noise. A constant stream of thoughts that seemed to have no connection to each other, no logical progression, no reasonable order. One moment Jake was thinking about the technical specifications of his cargo hauler's engine, the next he was remembering a song from something called Earth's 1980s, and then suddenly he was wondering if he'd remembered to turn off the coffee maker in his apartment on Luna Station. "Welcome to the Grand Tour," came Jake's voice, not spoken but somehow transmitted directly into Veltar's consciousness. The human's mental voice had the tone of a particularly sarcastic tour guide. "You're now experiencing what we humans call Tuesday morning brain. Please keep your arms and tentacles inside the ride at all times." Veltar tried to focus, to impose the kind of mental discipline that had served him through decades of interrogations. He reached for what should have been Jake's surface thoughts. the immediate concerns and fears that every species harbored. Instead, he found himself confronted with a grocery list that somehow included items like milk, bread, eggs, and that weird cheese that tastes like regret, followed immediately by a vivid memory of Jake trying to assemble furniture, using instructions that were apparently written by someone who had only heard about furniture third hand. "Oh, you found the IKEA incident," Jake's mental voice commented with obvious amusement. "That's from 2387. I spent 6 hours trying to build a bookshelf and ended up with what I can only describe as a very expensive modern art sculpture. It's still in my living room. I call it defeat." Veltar pushed deeper, searching for military intelligence, strategic information, anything useful. Instead, he found himself trapped in what appeared to be Jake's internal monologue about whether hot dogs were sandwiches, a debate that had apparently been ongoing for several years and showed no signs of resolution. "The structural integrity argument is compelling," Jake's thoughts continued. "But then you have to consider the philosophical implications of bread-to-meat ratios and the historical precedent set by the Earl of Sandwich himself. It's a complex issue that strikes at the very heart of human classification systems." "This is impossible," Veltar managed to project, his mental voice starting to show the first signs of strain. "Your thoughts make no logical sense. How do you function as a species?" "Function is a strong word," Jake replied cheerfully. "We prefer muddle through with style and an alarming amount of caffeine. Speaking of which, you're about to hit the anxiety sector. You might want to brace yourself." Before Veltar could ask what that meant, he was suddenly overwhelmed by a crushing wave of seemingly irrational fears. The fear that everyone at the last party Jake attended secretly hated him. The fear that he'd said something embarrassing to his neighbor 3 weeks ago and she was still thinking about it. The fear that somewhere in the galaxy there was a more successful space trucker who was better at parallel parking and had shinier boots. "That's the 3 a.m. special," Jake explained, his mental voice maintaining its cheerful tone despite the emotional chaos surrounding them. "Every human gets that package deal. Usually hits right when you're trying to sleep. We've learned to live with it. Kind of like learning to live with a really pessimistic roommate who never pays rent but always has opinions about your life choices." Veltar tried to retreat, to find some stable mental ground, but Jake's consciousness seemed to have no stable ground to offer. Every thought led to another thought, which led to a memory, which led to a random song lyric, which led to wondering why humans had decided that Wednesday was spelled the way it was when it clearly should be Wednesday. "The English language thing is a whole other tour," Jake noted. "We can do that next if you want. It's basically 2 hours of explaining why we have silent letters and why tough, through, and though are all pronounced differently, even though they look like they should rhyme." "Stop!" Veltar projected weakly, his mental voice beginning to crack under the strain. "I need to find tactical information. Military secrets, strategic intelligence." "Oh, you want the classified stuff?" Jake's mental voice perked up with interest. "Well, I can tell you that the coffee in the space station commissary is actually made from recycled protein paste, but they don't want anyone to know because it would hurt morale. Also, Captain Reynolds of the merchant vessel Lucky Strike has been cheating at poker for 6 months, but nobody says anything because he's going through a really messy divorce and we all feel bad for him." Veltar realized with growing horror that this was Jake's idea of classified information. There were no military secrets, no strategic plans, no hidden weaknesses in human defenses. There was just this endless stream of random thoughts, emotional chaos, and the kind of information that no rational species would consider worth protecting. "Wait, there's more," Jake continued, apparently enjoying himself. "Did you know that humans invented a device specifically for toasting bread, and then spent the next century arguing about what level of toastedness was optimal? We have charts, Veltar. Charts about toast preferences. We've turned breakfast into a science, and somehow we're still terrible at it." As Veltar's consciousness flailed helplessly in the chaos of Jake's mind, he began to understand why Dr. Crix had been so concerned. This wasn't just mental disorganization. This was a form of cognitive warfare so advanced that the humans probably didn't even realize they were doing it. They had turned their own mental chaos into the ultimate defense mechanism. "Oh, and we're just getting started," Jake's mental voice added with obvious relish. "Wait until you experience the part where I remember every embarrassing thing I've ever done, usually right when I'm trying to fall asleep. It's like a greatest hits album, but for shame." What happened next could only be described as the psychological equivalent of being thrown into a blender filled with emotions, memories, and the kind of mental static that humans had somehow learned to call normal thinking. Veltar found himself pulled deeper into Jake's consciousness, and if he thought the surface level was chaotic, the deeper layers were like being trapped in a kaleidoscope designed by someone who had never seen colors before, but had very strong opinions about them. First came the memory cascade. Jake's mind helpfully provided a detailed replay of every time he'd ever said "you too" when a waiter told him to enjoy his meal. Each incident was presented in high-definition embarrassment, complete with the facial expressions of confused restaurant staff and Jake's internal commentary about how he should probably just stop eating in public forever. "This is from last Tuesday," Jake's mental voice explained, as Veltar experienced the full emotional weight of ordering coffee and responding to "have a nice day" with "thanks you too, I love you." The memory included the barista's bewildered expression and Jake's subsequent decision to never return to that particular space station again. "I've been avoiding that coffee shop for 6 days now. I'm pretty sure I'm going to have to find a new trade route." But before Veltar could process the sheer absurdity of restructuring interstellar commerce routes to avoid minor social embarrassment, Jake's mind cheerfully moved on to the next exhibit in what was apparently the Museum of Human Psychological Torture. Suddenly, Veltar was experiencing what humans called the song. Not just any song, but the one song that gets stuck in your head and refuses to leave, no matter how much you beg, plead, or threaten your own brain. In this case, it was something called Baby Shark, and it had apparently been playing on repeat in Jake's subconscious for 3 months. "Baby Shark, do 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 do," Jake's mental voice sang with the kind of cheerful malevolence that suggested he was genuinely enjoying Veltar's suffering. "My niece played it for me when I was on Earth leave. It's been my constant companion ever since. I've tried everything to get rid of it. Meditation, alcohol, even that time I tried to override it by listening to classical music for 6 hours straight. Nothing works. It's like a cognitive parasite that feeds on sanity." Veltar tried to escape the musical nightmare, but Jake's consciousness had other plans. The alien found himself thrust into what could only be described as the Anxiety Olympics, a mental arena where every possible worst-case scenario was not only considered, but explored in excruciating detail. He experienced Jake's recurring fear that he'd left his apartment door unlocked, which led to the fear that someone would break in, which led to the fear that they would judge his furniture choices, which led to the fear that he had terrible taste in everything, which led to the fear that everyone he'd ever met had been too polite to tell him he was completely hopeless as a human being. "That's the anxiety spiral," Jake explained helpfully as Veltar felt his alien consciousness being pulled deeper into the vortex of irrational fears. "It starts with something simple like, 'Did I lock the door?' and somehow ends with, 'I am a failure as a sentient being and probably shouldn't be allowed to operate heavy machinery.' The human brain can connect any two thoughts if you give it enough time and caffeine." But Jake wasn't done. Oh no, he was just getting warmed up. Next came the experience of human decision-making, which Veltar quickly realized was less decision-making and more standing in front of a menu for 20 minutes trying to decide between 2 identical sandwiches, while your brain provides a running commentary on how this choice will somehow define you as a person. Veltar found himself reliving Jake's experience of choosing a Netflix show, a process that had apparently taken 47 minutes and involved reading the descriptions of over 200 different options before settling on rewatching something he'd already seen 12 times. The alien experienced every moment of the decision-making process, including the growing existential dread that maybe he was wasting his life, maybe he should be doing something more productive, maybe he should learn a new language or take up hiking or at least organize his sock drawer. "The Netflix paradox," Jake's mental voice observed with the tone of someone discussing a fundamental law of physics. "The more options you have, the less capable you become of choosing any of them. It's like decision paralysis, but with more subscription fees." By now, Veltar was beginning to make sounds that the universal translator was having difficulty processing. They were somewhere between screams and the kind of noise you might make if you were trying to solve advanced mathematics while being attacked by a swarm of particularly aggressive butterflies. Dr. Crix, watching the proceedings from the relative safety of the observation room, was frantically trying to shut down the neural extraction device. His forearms moved in a blur of panic as he typed emergency shutdown codes while simultaneously trying to contact the medical bay and possibly the nearest psychiatric facility. "Commander Veltar, can you hear me?" Dr. Crix called through the intercom, his voice climbing to frequencies that were probably only audible to small mammals and very anxious scientists. "You need to disengage from the human's mind, immediately. Your neural patterns are becoming dangerously unstable." But Veltar was too deep in the Jake Morris experience to respond. He was currently being subjected to what Jake called the Sunday night special, a unique form of temporal anxiety where you simultaneously dread going to work tomorrow while feeling guilty about not enjoying your weekend more, while also worrying about all the things you should have done but didn't, while also wondering if you remembered to charge your communication device. "This is advanced-level human thinking," Jake's mental voice explained with obvious pride. We can feel guilty about not enjoying ourselves while we're actively not enjoying ourselves. It's like emotional recursion, but with more self-loathing. The final straw came when Jake's mind decided to share his collection of shower arguments, detailed mental recreations of conversations where he'd thought of the perfect comeback hours after the original interaction had ended. Veltar found himself experiencing Jake's fantasy of what he should have said to his high school history teacher, his ex-girlfriend, and that guy at the spaceport who had criticized his parking. Each imaginary conversation was presented with the kind of vivid detail usually reserved for traumatic memories, complete with Jake's internal commentary about how he was definitely going to be ready with the perfect response next time, even though next time had been 15 years ago, and the other person had probably forgotten the entire interaction. That's the human superpower, Jake's mental voice said with satisfaction as Veltar's consciousness writhed in confusion. We can lose an argument and then spend the next decade winning it in our heads. It's like time travel, but more pathetic. Commander Veltar finally managed to project a single desperate thought. Please make it stop. Oh, we're just getting to the good part, Jake replied cheerfully. Wait until you experience my thoughts about whether I said goodbye to enough people at that party last month, and whether my laugh is too loud, and whether I should have worn the other shirt, and whether everyone thinks I'm weird for bringing homemade cookies to a space station potluck. That's when Veltar began screaming in languages that Dr. Crix was pretty sure didn't exist yet. The emergency disconnection from Jake's mind was like being yanked out of a hurricane by a very concerned rescue team, except the hurricane was made of pure psychological chaos, and the rescue team was one extremely panicked alien scientist with too many arms and not enough sedatives. Commander Veltar's consciousness snapped back into his own body with the kind of jarring impact usually reserved for small spacecraft colliding with large asteroids. For approximately 30 seconds, Veltar just sat there, his 8-foot frame trembling like a leaf in a cosmic windstorm. His skin had cycled through every color in the visible spectrum and was now apparently trying to invent new ones. His glowing eyes flickered like broken emergency lights, and when he finally opened his mouth to speak, what came out was a sound that the universal translator gave up trying to interpret and simply labeled as existential screaming. Commander! Dr. Crix rushed over, his forearms moving in frantic gestures as he checked readings on various medical devices. Are you all right? Can you hear me? Do you remember your name? What year is it? How many moons does Zephyria Prime have? Veltar turned to look at his subordinate, and when he spoke, his voice carried the haunted quality of someone who had seen too much and understood too little. Crix, he whispered, they have a mental process called wondering if you locked the door that can somehow connect to questioning every life decision you've ever made in under 30 seconds. How is this possible? How do they function? How do they sleep at night? Well, Jake interjected helpfully from his chair, apparently none the worse for wear after having his brain invaded by an alien intelligence. The answer to that last one is badly, and with a lot of melatonin supplements. But hey, you handled it better than most. Usually by now alien interrogators are trying to join human meditation groups, or asking about our coffee recipes. You only screamed in 3 different languages. That's actually pretty impressive. Dr. Crix was frantically scrolling through his datapad, his skin growing paler by the second. Commander, I've been reviewing the archives while you were incapacitated. It appears that the Empire has attempted to interrogate human minds 17 times in the past century. And? Veltar asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer wasn't going to improve his day. Well, sir, Interrogator QX Vaughn from the first attempt is now living on a human colony world where he runs a small coffee shop and practices something called mindfulness meditation. He sends the Empire annual reports about his anxiety levels and rates of personal growth. Veltar's left eye began to twitch in a way that suggested his nervous system was still recovering from its recent encounter with human consciousness. Continue. Commander Ziltara from the 7th attempt joined a human book club and now writes poetry about the existential nature of choice paralysis. Her last transmission included 14 pages about whether she should have ordered the Caesar salad instead of the soup at lunch. There's more, isn't there? Veltar asked, his voice carrying the resigned tone of someone who had given up hope of good news. Dr. Chris nodded miserably. Chief Interrogator Valnox from the 12th attempt has been in intensive therapy for 3 years. His last psychological evaluation noted that he's developed what human doctors call generalized anxiety disorder and has become obsessed with checking whether he turned off the lights in his office. He's requested transfer to a desk job in accounting. And the others? Various forms of what humans call quarter-life crisis, midlife crisis, and existential dread. One of them started a support group for aliens who have touched human minds and live to regret it. They meet twice a week and discuss coping mechanisms. Veltar stood up slowly, his legs shaking like he'd just completed a marathon while carrying a small planet. When he spoke, his voice had taken on a distinctly human inflection that made Dr. Crick's skin go completely transparent with horror. "Dude," Veltar said, the word feeling strange and wrong coming from his alien vocal cords. That was like totally intense. I literally cannot even right now. Is this what humans call being shook? Because I am definitely shook. "Commander," Dr. Chris whispered, "you're speaking in human colloquialisms. This is a clear sign of psychological contamination. We need to get you to the medical bay immediately." But Veltar was already moving toward the communication console, his movements jerky and uncertain like someone who had forgotten how their own body worked. "I need to contact High Command. This is a Code 7 emergency. No, wait, is Code 7 for invasive species or psychological warfare? I can't remember. Why can't I remember? Oh no, what if I'm having a senior moment? Do I look old to you? Am I having a midlife crisis? What even is the middle of a Zephyrian lifespan?" "Commander, please," Dr. Crix pleaded. "You're spiraling. This is exactly what happened to Interrogator QX Vaughn before he started asking about human breathing exercises." Jake watched the proceedings with the satisfied expression of someone who had just proven a particularly important point. "You know," he said conversationally, "I probably should have mentioned that human minds are kind of like psychological booby traps. We've spent millions of years evolving to survive in groups, while simultaneously being convinced that everyone secretly hates us and we're terrible at everything. It's created a very specific kind of mental environment that most alien species find challenging." Veltar had managed to establish contact with High Command, and his report was a masterpiece of barely controlled panic. "High Command, this is Commander Veltar requesting immediate evacuation of all Imperial forces from human space. The humans are not a minor species. They are a psychological weapon of mass destruction disguised as an inferior civilization." The response from High Command was immediate and confused. "Commander, please clarify, are the humans technologically advanced? Do they possess superior weapons?" "No, sir," Veltar replied, his voice cracking slightly. "They possess something far more dangerous. They have anxiety about whether they're good enough at their jobs, while simultaneously procrastinating on important tasks, while also feeling guilty about not calling their mothers enough, while also wondering if they should have ordered different coffee this morning. And somehow they consider this normal." There was a long pause from High Command. Then, "Commander, are you having a breakdown?" "Sir, I have experienced the human concept of Sunday scaries. The fear of Monday morning that starts on Sunday afternoon and somehow connects to every poor decision you've ever made in your entire life. I have felt their decision-making process, which involves considering 37 different factors for choosing between 2 types of breakfast cereal. I have experienced their ability to feel guilty about not enjoying a vacation while actively not enjoying the vacation. This is not a breakdown, sir. This is enlightenment, and it is terrifying." Within minutes, the official response came through. "All Imperial forces are hereby ordered to withdraw from human space immediately. Humans are to be classified as a Class 12 psychological hazard. Any personnel who have experienced human mind contact are to report for immediate psychological evaluation and counseling." Dr. Crix looked up from his datapad with the expression of someone who had just watched their entire worldview collapse. "Commander, I'm reading 17 more evacuation orders from Imperial fleets across human space. Apparently word travels fast when an entire species accidentally develops weaponized anxiety." Veltar nodded slowly, then looked at Jake with something that might have been respect if it weren't so clearly mixed with terror. "Human," he said formally, "on behalf of the Zephyrian Empire, I apologize for this interrogation. You are free to go, with our compliments and our sincere recommendation that your species continue doing exactly what you're doing, because it's the most effective defense system in the galaxy." "Thanks," Jake replied cheerfully. "Same time next week?" The sound Veltar made in response was probably laughter, but it might have been crying. With humans, as he was learning, it was often hard to tell the difference. 3 weeks later, Captain Jake Bulldog Morrison was back to his regular route between the Proxima trade stations and the Outer Rim colonies, hauling synthetic coffee beans and enjoying the kind of peaceful solitude that came with being classified as a Class 00 psychological hazard by the most powerful empire in the galaxy. His cargo hold was notably fuller than usual, thanks to the official Imperial apology package that had included a lifetime supply of premium space coffee a formal diplomatic immunity certificate, and what appeared to be a very expensive fruit basket with a note that read, "Please don't think too hard near our borders." The diplomatic immunity alone was worth more than Jake's ship, but the real prize was the communication device they'd given him with a direct line to Imperial High Command. Not for emergencies, mind you, but apparently so he could check in periodically and let them know how he was doing emotionally speaking. The mighty Zephyrian Empire, conquerors of 3,000 worlds, had essentially given him a cosmic therapy hotline. Jake was humming along to an old Earth song, something about blue skies and sunshine, when his communication array chimed with an incoming message. The caller ID made him grin. Dr. Crix, Zephyrian Imperial Xenopsychology Division, Trauma Recovery Unit. "Jake?" Dr. Crix's voice came through the speakers with the kind of enthusiasm usually reserved for discovering a new form of coffee, or finding out your tax return included a refund. "How are you feeling today? Are you experiencing any anxiety? Any decision paralysis? Are you having any thoughts about whether you locked your apartment door?" "Doc," Jake replied, leaning back in his pilot's seat. "I'm doing great. Just finished a nice quiet run to the Centauri system. Nobody tried to interrogate me, probe my mind, or classify me as a threat to galactic peace. It's been a good day." "That's wonderful to hear," Dr. Crix said, and Jake could hear the sound of frantic note-taking in the background. "I'm actually calling with some updates about Commander Veltar. He's been asking about you." Jake raised an eyebrow. "How's our purple friend doing? Still having existential crises about breakfast cereal?" "Well," Dr. Crix said carefully, "he's made remarkable progress. He's been attending human psychology seminars via hologram, and he's developed what he calls a healthy relationship with uncertainty. Last week, he successfully chose a restaurant for dinner without having a panic attack about whether the other option would have been better." "That's great news," Jake said genuinely. "Tell him I'm proud of him. It took me 37 years to master that skill." "Actually," Dr. Crix continued, "he's started a support group for Imperial officers who've had contact with human minds. They meet twice a week to discuss coping strategies and practice what humans call mindfulness meditation. The group has grown to over 200 members." Jake nearly spit out his coffee. 200? How many of you guys have been poking around in human heads?" "More than we initially realized," Dr. Crix admitted. "It turns out that human psychological patterns are so distinctive that even brief telepathic contact can cause what we're now calling human thought contamination syndrome. The symptoms include excessive worry about social interactions, the inability to make simple decisions without overthinking, and an inexplicable urge to check whether you've turned off appliances." "Sounds like Tuesday," Jake said cheerfully. "Any other exciting developments in the world of intergalactic psychology?" "Well," Dr. Crix said, his voice taking on the tone of someone sharing particularly interesting gossip, "the Regelian Collective attempted to establish mental contact with a human diplomat last month. Within 6 hours, their entire hive mind was debating whether they should have worn different ceremonial robes to the peace negotiations." Jake laughed so hard he nearly choked on his coffee. "A whole hive mind got self-conscious about their outfit choices?" "The debate lasted for 3 days," Dr. Crix confirmed. "They eventually had to segment part of their collective consciousness just to contain the fashion anxiety. They're now requesting human consultants to help them develop what they call confidence-building exercises for planet-scale entities." "This keeps getting better," Jake said, wiping tears from his eyes. "What else?" "The Andromedan energy beings tried to analyze human dream patterns and accidentally absorbed someone's recurring nightmare about showing up to work in their underwear. They spent 2 weeks trying to figure out what underwear was and why the absence of it would cause professional embarrassment." Jake shook his head in amazement. "We really are the universe's most effective accidental weapon, aren't we?" "Indeed," Dr. Crix agreed. "The Imperial Strategic Command has actually classified human mental patterns as a form of passive defense system. They're calling it cognitive chaos theory, and they're studying it as a potential model for psychological warfare." "That's both flattering and terrifying," Jake said. "Are they planning to weaponize anxiety?" "Oh no," Dr. Crix said quickly. "The research was discontinued after the lead scientist spent 3 hours in a decision paralysis loop, trying to choose which type of psychological chaos to study first. He's now in therapy and has developed a hobby of collecting houseplants to bring more certainty into his life." As Jake continued his journey through the cosmos, he reflected on the strange turn his life had taken. A few weeks ago, he'd been just another space trucker hauling cargo between the stars. Now he was apparently a walking example of humanity's greatest superpower, the ability to make existential dread feel like a normal Tuesday afternoon. His communication device chimed again, this time with a message from Imperial High Command. Jake opened it to find a formal request, written in the kind of diplomatic language that suggested it had been reviewed by at least 17 different committees. Captain Morrison, the message read, the Zephyrian Empire would like to formally invite you to serve as a cultural consultant for our new Department of Human Psychological Phenomena. Your duties would include explaining why humans consider overthinking to be a hobby, why you can feel tired after sleeping for 8 hours, and why you somehow manage to lose your keys while holding them in your hand. The position comes with full diplomatic status, unlimited coffee allowances, and hazard pay. Jake stared at the message for a long moment, then started laughing. The idea of being paid to explain human weirdness to confused aliens was so absurd, it might actually be perfect. He composed his reply. Dear Imperial High Command, I accept your offer with one condition. I get to keep my truck and my route. Some of us humans need our space to properly cultivate our existential dread. Also, I'm going to need you to define unlimited coffee allowances, because you clearly don't understand the scope of human caffeine dependency. As he sent the message and settled back into his pilot's seat, Jake couldn't help but smile. Humanity had accidentally conquered the galaxy not through superior technology or military might, but through the simple act of being themselves. They'd turned their neuroses into a defense system, their anxiety into a weapon, and their tendency to overthink everything into a galactic diplomatic advantage. It was, Jake thought as he watched the stars drift by, probably the most human thing they'd ever accomplished. They'd managed to succeed by being a complete psychological disaster, and they'd done it without even trying. Somewhere in the back of his mind, he started wondering if he should have packed more snacks for the journey, which led to wondering if he'd remembered to lock his apartment, which led to wondering if he should have chosen a different career path, which led to wondering if other species ever had these kinds of thoughts. And then he remembered that the answer to that last question was no. And that's exactly why we're winning. The universe, it seemed, wasn't ready for the full power of human overthinking. But Jake Morrison, space trucker turned accidental galactic diplomat, was perfectly content to keep showing them what they were missing. After all, someone had to explain to the aliens why humans could simultaneously be bored and anxious, tired and restless, hungry and unable to decide what to eat. It was honest work, and somebody had to do it. Even if that somebody was going to spend the next 20 minutes wondering if he'd explained it properly.